In the next section, you will learn how to set up dynamic list controls that generate their child controls via data binding. You're going to make the contents of the whole form dependent on a single reference table with the help of two dynamic list controls nested into each other, plus some clever reference data filtering. When you are done, the parts of the truck, the groups that they appear in the form, and the optional parts that the driver can report about come from the parts reference table, and the form will automatically update the controls and control values whenever the data in the reference table changes. In a dynamic list control, you only need to declare a template for the generated child elements. The dynamic list control will generate the template that you set up inside it for each row returned by the query specified in its generator attribute. You will first learn how to turn one of the three pop-up panels in your form into a dynamic list control, so that the car parts that are listed inside it come from a list of car parts in the Rocky Jupiter database. Create the reference table declaration file for the parts reference table that you'll bind into the front of vehicle pop-up panel. The parts reference table will contain a single column named part_name. The data type of the values in the column must be text, and a column must not be empty. Save the declaration file as parts.refm. Publish the folder to generate the reference table. To populate the reference tables with data, you will modify your input data spreadsheet or download the modified version from our tutorial pages. Save the file to your Rocky Jupiter folder. Your reftab.xlsx will have a new parts worksheet that contains a few part names. Open your form. You'll make the pop-up front panel show the yes-no controls dynamically, based on the data in the freshly created parts reference table. Wrap your first segmented control and submitter panel with the new parts front panel. And remove all the other segmented controls and submitter panels. The parts front panel is a dynamic list control. It has a generator attribute. The select part name from reference_parts query returns all the rows from parts. Replace the segmented controls label with the front segmented label at the beginning of the front's part panel. This new label is data bound to the first column that its parent returns, which are the names of the car parts. Modify the names and references so that the submitter panel stays data bound to the segmented control above it. Instead of the specific car part related names, rename the controls to reflect the vehicle region they belong to. The template in the dynamic list control, the label, the segmented control with the validator, and the submitter panel is generated for every row that the query returns. Save the file and publish your solution. Open your form on your mobile phone. As you can see, the names and number of the segmented controls reflect the reference table data. This experiment of generating the contents of a pop-up panel worked out nicely. Let's repeat the process for the other two pop-up panels. First, you'll need to put the static data inside the pop-up rear and pop-up engine panels into the parts reference table and bind the two pop-ups to the reference table. Then you add a second column to filter the relevant car parts into one of the 3 pop-up panels in your form. To add a second column, you will be modifying the declaration file. Name the column where_in_vehicle and use the type equals text and not null equals true attributes. Save the file. Open your spreadsheet and add the second column to indicate which pop-up panel the car part in question belongs to. Just like you did with the pop-up front panel, you'll make rear of vehicle and engine dynamic list controls that generate their template based on a query statement. However, this time, change the query statement in their generator attribute so that it only returns the rows that have a particular value in the where_in_vehicle field. The where_in_vehicle expression inside the query statement of the dynamic list controls is what makes this happen. It makes sure that each dynamic list control only pulls the relevant reference data from the reference table. You will need to change the code for the 2 other pop-up panels, as I did in advance. Don't forget to modify the segmented controls and the submitter panels inside the dynamic list controls. Save the modified form, publish your solution, and check it on your phone. Now you can see the reference data-based contents of the pop-up panels. What if Rocky Jupiter's policy changes, and drivers have to inspect, say, the undercarriage of the truck as well? You would have to come back to the form source and set up a 4th panel. To really automate updating the form whenever the reference data changes, you need to get rid of these 3 separate pop-up panels that you have to label by hand separately. You need to nest the dynamic list control that generates the child elements of the pop-up panel inside another dynamic list control. You will merge the 3 pop-up panels into the pop-up generator dynamic list control, so you need only 1 pop-up panel. Get rid of both the pop-up rear and the pop-up engine panel. The generator query statement in the pop-up generator references parts, but has the distinct where_in_vehicle statement, which makes sure that its child elements are generated as many times as there are distinct vehicle regions defined in the reference table at any time. For each of the vehicle regions, you'd like a label that displays its name. Call this pop-up header. Its parent .column0 refarg attribute references the first, and in this case only column, that is returned by the query of its parent control. Below the label, each region will have its own pop-up. Name this panel Pop-up Wrapper. You'll be making its label dynamic in a moment, so you can safely remove its label attribute. Because both pop-up header and pop-up wrapper are child elements of the pop-up generator dynamic list control, they will serve as the template for the generated content. The vehicle region values returned by the query in pop-up generator are referenced in 2 labels. The pop-up header is outside, and the pop-up label is inside the pop-up wrapper pop-up panel. So the same vehicle region will appear both next to the pop-up link and above the collection of segmented controls. Your users will easily navigate the form because they'll see the headers for the pop-up panels on the main screen of the form, and also when they enter the pop-ups. Inside the pop-up wrapper panel is where you need to nest the second dynamic list control. Name it Pop-up Content. It contains the template for the segmented controls and their labels and validator, the submitter, and the optional parts panel. Instead of the static reference that you had earlier, the query in pop-up content references the value in pop-up header. Which in turn references the query in pop-up generator and filters out the returned rows whose where_in_vehicle field does not match the header of the pop-up. This makes sure that each pop-up panel only lists the relevant parts. Modify the names and references of the label, the segmented control, the submitter, and the optional parts panel, and make them generic. In your new streamlined code, all the vehicle regions share a single label, segmented control, and submitter, so you don't need any region names. Remove the region-specific parts of your control names. Save the modified file. To test whether the data binding works, you could add a new row to the input data spreadsheet with undercarriage in the where_in_vehicle before you publish the new form. Make the test changes and publish. A fourth pop-up panel should be generated in the form. Your form is now ready for any changes in the parts reference table. The code looks much more compact and is more flexible, but you still have a separate reference table to populate the drop-down choices in the optional parts panel. What's even worse is that the same choices appear inside every drop-down list in the pop-up panels, because all of them reference the same optional parts reference table. This is definitely not good. You don't want to set up a separate reference table for each vehicle region. Using the same logic as before, you could cut the data in the optional parts reference table and insert it into the parts reference table, then add a column to filter the rows into the yes/no questions or the choices of the Add New Part dropdown. This way, your form uses only the combined reference table instead of two separate databases that need to be maintained and queried separately. You want a new column in the parts reference table, so you want a modified reference table declaration. Name the new column required. Its data type will be integer, and the column must not be empty. Download and open the new version of Input Data spreadsheet from our tutorial pages, which contains a few new rows for each of the vehicle regions, and indicates with 1 or 0 in the required column if a given row should generate a yes/no question or a choice in the optional car parts dropdown. Note that the reftab.xlsx file now contains one sheet instead of two. Modify the form to make the query statements filter the data by the required column. The optional dropdown now references parts instead of optional parts. You have to make one more change. You have to specify the path of the referenced parameter. You are using the parameter to filter the reference table column that you query with the value in the pop-up header control. This path needs 4 parent node indicators because it is a relative reference from inside a dynamic list control, and an extra parent node indicator is needed to escape the generated child elements inside the dynamic list control before the reference can move up in the control hierarchy. Save and publish the file as usual. Check the choices for the car part dropdown in the pop-up panels. You might possibly never have to touch this form again, and yet its controls can be updated whenever needed. All it takes is changing the data in the parts reference table.